It seems we're hearing more and more that society is becoming secular. But what does that really mean? I'm David Hamstra, and in this Project Atlas video, we'll be talking about secularity and why it matters. There's lots of different meanings that people use when they say the word secular. Some might talk about a secular society as being one where religion is practiced in private and the government isn't telling people what to believe and churches aren't telling the government what to do. We could also talk about a secular education as one where sciences and the humanities guide the way, and there is no authoritative religious text being handed down as the final arbiter of truth. In evangelical subculture, the word secular is used to describe entertainment that doesn't explicitly tell you about God or Jesus or carry Christian values at the forefront. But what unites all these meanings of secular is what we want to discuss today, and to do that, we're going to have to get down to the bottom of some heavy ideas. Now, I didn't come up with the content of this video on my own. I came up with it by reading in a bunch of books. These are some of the most important ones. I'm showing you my sources now because I won't be referring to them explicitly as we go along in this video. But if you'd like to talk about these authors with me, I'm happy to do so in the comments later on. So with that, let's dive right in. The word secular comes from an old Latin word seculum, which meant the amount of time that it took for a generation to have a coherent experience. We could translate seculum with the English word age, as in the age of discovery, the age of enlightenment, the space age, the information age, and so on. Well, around the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire, Christians took this word seculum and began using it to describe the common human experience that we have in fallen time. In the Christian story, fallen time is the time between the times of God's eternity past and eternity future. So in the Christian story, God existed forever in a state of beauty, peace, harmony, complete and utter goodness. And that was the reality into which he brought humanity when we were created. But soon after creation, humanity fell to the temptations of the devil, and thus brought in sickness, death, suffering, sorrow, all these negative experiences that we have in the world today. But that's not how it's supposed to be forever. Because in the Christian story, God comes back and restores all that was lost and brings about a final redemption of humanity, where we can return to that good and peaceful world that we were originally intended to inhabit. In the medieval life, this word seculum then came to qualify an adjective, secular. This is our first use of the word secular. And secular in the Middle Ages was opposed to religious, but not in the way that we do it today. In the Middle Ages, the religious were the people who devoted their lives to improving people's world to come experience, the afterlife, if you will. What happens after you die? What happens after Christ returns? So they would devote their lives to things like studying God's word and teaching other people about it, offering many prayers for people who had died, dispensing the sacraments of the church, which was like a power-up to get you closer to heaven. On the other hand, they had secular people. And the secular were not those who didn't care anything for God or didn't go to church. They did all those things, but their lives were more focused on providing benefits for people in the here and now. So whereas the religious would spend most of their time praying or studying, copying manuscripts, whatever, the secular were out there plowing the fields, bringing the water, looking after the animals, and even the higher orders of society were secular, right? Those who were running things, making the laws, defending the people, all that stuff, that all pertained to the things of the saeculum, the time between the times, and what we need to do to exist here and now until the hereafter comes. So the secular looked after that aspect of life, and the religious looked after the other aspect of life. So as we can see, when it comes to being secular, originally it really was all about time. It was about the time we're living in and how we spend the time of our lives, what kind of benefits we're pursuing in this life. So if it's all about time, then that raises the question, what is time? That is a profoundly difficult question to answer. There are, in fact, potentially many answers that are correct to the question, what is time? But for our purposes today, I want to focus on time as the common substrate of human experience. Time is the interface between our consciousness and reality. Time is what binds together reality for all human beings. In fact, we have no experiences that aren't mediated by time in some way. And because time is so central to how we interact with reality, how we organize our time constitutes a preconceptual, often unstated interpretation of reality for us. And these rhythms of our life, that is how we organize our time, therefore shapes our perception of reality. It shapes what's imaginable, thinkable, conceivable, and even knowable. Because how we use our time tells us what matters. And because our rhythms are commonly shared among people in our community, our nation, even our world at times, how we use our time allows us to have a common conception of what matters, and therefore cooperate with one another as human beings in pursuing what we think of as the good life. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody will agree on what to do about what matters. What's important is that there is a fundamental agreement about what matters that we can argue about. And that argument, which is passed down from generation to generation, is what constitutes a tradition. That is the sense in which I would like us to take up the question of secularity today. What is it as a tradition? And the way that you enter into a tradition is not so much by defining its essential features that always have to be there, but rather by telling the story of its argument. And that's what we're going to do today. So let's rejoin the story of secularity where we left it off in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was a time when life was governed by the rhythms of the church. The days were organized according to the ringing of the church bell, calling people to prayer. The weeks were organized around the sacrifice of the Mass, where you got your spiritual power up to get you a little closer to heaven. And the months contained special feast and fast days to commemorate historic events and people in the church. And finally, the entire year was structured around a series of holidays that taught people the story of the Christian gospel. These rhythms fit secular, that is, worldly pursuits, into a constellation of meanings derived from the eternal significance that was potentially there in each moment. And that gave life a fullness of meaning that was very satisfying to many people. But it also had some problems associated with it. One of those problems was that so many resources were devoted to pursuing higher meaning in life that many things that could have been done to help alleviate human suffering didn't happen. And the Middle Ages was a time of great misery for many, even if it had a lot of meaning to them. Another problem was that it created the potential for many people to simply sink back into the meanings assigned to them by the culture they were living in, and therefore allow them to consider themselves Christian when in fact they hadn't made a full commitment to following Christ. And when you put those two problems together, it allowed for huge abuses to be perpetrated by the church. Because in the Middle Ages, the highway to heaven had two lanes. There was a fast lane for those who wanted to say all the prayers and do all the right things and not do many bad things. And if you were even really good, you could get to heaven with some extra spiritual gasoline that you could then dispense from heaven to other people to help them power up and get to heaven even quicker. But if you wanted to maximize your life in this world, as long as you didn't do anything too terribly bad, you could get away with a lot of stuff and then suffer for it in purgatory after you died until your sufferings were done and you were ready to go to heaven. So for religious people, that is the monks and the priests and the bishops who were more into the slow lane than the fast lane, This allowed them to extract immense resources from people who were poor and suffering and wanted to get to heaven quicker and were willing to give up many things in order to have that. And therefore, the priests and the bishops were able to line their pockets at their expense. They had a Reformation to turn the 2 lanes into 1 lane. Just over 400 years ago, Martin Luther posted those 95 Theses in which he decried the abuses of the church. And that set off a shockwave that resulted in a split down the middle of the church. Because the reformers weren't satisfied to make just a few tweaks around the edges. They wanted to overhaul the whole system that allowed for those abuses to be perpetrated in the first place. And so they did one really important thing, which is to say that people didn't have to go through the church to get their salvation to heaven. What you really had to do was accept the gracious gift that Jesus offered you through his sacrifice on the cross. And then, when you had done that, you would be motivated to be a good person and a committed Christian believer because of the greatness of what you had understood that God did for you. So this is when religion first went from meaning something that you did to something that defined who you were. During the Middle Ages, religion was however seriously you practiced your faith. But following the Reformation, when you had a choice of what kind of Christian you were to be, religion became something that defined your commitments in life. And therefore the word secular changed its meaning as well. It went from meaning a way that you lived your life to the realm of things that didn't have to do with religion, so that people who disagreed about their religious commitments could still agree on what it took to get along in this world. So religion became your set of ultimate commitments that defined who you were, and secular became everything else that was needed for this life on which people could agree, even if they didn't agree about matters that were considered now religious. And that raised a problem for certain Protestants, because how do you really know that your set of belief commitments that define your religion are in fact the ones that are going to get you to heaven in the end? Well, the answer to that question was that you will know because God will bless you with the good life in the here and now as well. And how do you get those blessings? Well, you have to go out and work hard so that you can receive them. And this is where we get what's sometimes called the Protestant work ethic. Because if you have to work hard to receive those blessings, that means you can't be keeping all those feast days and fast days any longer. If you have to work hard to receive those blessings, then that means we can't have people who just devote their entire lives to praying and meditating and copying manuscripts and so on and so forth in order to get other people to heaven quicker. We have to all get down to work and be as productive as possible when we're not in church in order that we can get that confirmation that we are, in fact, those whom God has chosen to save. And thus, as the organization of time changed, the times began to change because it's all about time. Here's how the times began to change. When you think that it's God's job to pour out blessings on you in this world, you can start to think that that's, in fact, all that God is good for. And as you begin to organize your time around being productive and find more and more scientific discoveries that make life better and better, you can start to think that the way God is good for you in this world is that he has set up regularities in nature for us to discover and figure out how to build a better life for ourselves. And if that's the case, then it would be a threat to that order and regularity if God were to come down and intervene in our reality in some miraculous way. And so the deists arose, a group of people who thought that what God does is set up heaven and hell to motivate us to be good people and sets up a regular order in the universe for us to discover and learn, but the rest is up to us. But this illusion was shattered by the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, which leveled one of Europe's most progressive cities. And people thought, well, if God is supposed to set up regularity and order in nature for us to progress to the good life, then how can these kinds of random and absurd events happen that just confront us with the potential for absolute meaninglessness in nature? People began to ask the question, well, if God's job is to make sure that reality is set up in such a way that we can progress on to the good life and live in peace and harmony forevermore, exactly how good of a job is God doing at that? And so out of deism arose the first seeds of atheism, which said that we don't need God to be good people. We've been making ourselves better people all the way along. And we don't need God to give meaning to reality. Reality means whatever helps us to make a better life for ourselves in this world. Now, those post-Reformation moves were mostly confined to European elites. It took another 150 years before World War I shattered the illusion of irrevocable progress for the rest of European society. And then it took another 50 years after that till the post-World War II era, when people began to feel comfortable enough expressing their doubts that atheism went mainstream. So it's clear that the times have changed between that medieval era where you could sink comfortably back into Christian belief and just be carried along in it by your culture without ever really committing, and the times that we live in now, where we have so many options of belief and unbelief that it's hard to know even which to choose from. It's clear that in our post-World War II world, we live in a very different time from the medieval peasant who could comfortably sink back into his Christian culture and be carried along by streams of half-hearted belief. In our time, we have so many different beliefs to choose from, it's hard to know how to even make the choice, not to mention all the different varieties of unbelief. So what characterizes the difference between our culture and theirs? Again, it's about time. To be secular in our times means to be carried along by the rhythms of clock time. Clock time divides up all times into equal measurements so that they all have the same meaning. There are no times and rhythms like there were in the medieval era that connect you into higher eternal significances. All time is there to be filled by whatever meaning we assign to it. Clock time does not allow for God to have pre-assigned meanings to specific times. And clock time pushes us towards imagining that all that really matters in life is the here and now. That is anything that we can measure with our clocks, with our calendars. And adopting clock time is powerful because it has produced great benefits that we all enjoy. We talked about the benefits of productivity already, but we could touch on, for example, right now, the benefits of communications technology. This video is coming to you because human beings have been able to divide time down to the atomic, and perhaps if you're using a cell phone, you have even to thank dividing time to the quantum level for your ability to see this video. And so the sameness of the meaning of clock time, combined with the power of the benefits that it gives us, pushes those of us who live in this secular time toward thinking that all that matters for life is our flourishing in this world, in the here and now, and that any meaning that might come into our lives from beyond clock time is optional. So how are we supposed to choose between those options? How do we choose whether to live our lives by the clock or whether to seek some kind of higher meaning beyond the clock? How do we choose whether to live our lives by the clock or whether to seek some higher meaning beyond the clock? Most of us think that when we choose like this. First, we figure out how best to know something. Then we go out and actually try to know it. And then when we're done figuring out what we know, we have to figure out how we're going to live in light of what we know. But the story of secularity that we've just learned puts the lie to that notion. Because as we've seen, the way that we live is always already affecting how we can know, and therefore is shaping what we are able to know. This is because how we live inculcates a sense of what matters to us. And what matters to us determines our fundamental moral stance on how we think we can best know things. So in the world of secularity, of clock time, if you will, there are two basic moral stances toward how to know reality. Stance number one is knowing through clock time. It says reality is meaningless until we assign meaning to it. And therefore, I'm not going to accept any false comforts of pre-assigned meanings coming to me from beyond what I can reach in this world. That's for spiritually weak people. I face reality as it is, in all its apparent meaningless and absurdity, and try to forge a sense of meaning out of it, starting from what I can know of myself and working my way out, doubting everything until I can show that it is most likely true. I join with other people who are committed to the same kind of knowing, and together we create models of how the universe works, and we use those models of how the universe works to hack the universe and thereby improve the lives of ourselves and those around us, benefiting all humanity and bringing us forward, forging more and more meaning out of absurdity. This has provided unprecedented benefits for humanity in the here and now, and therefore you should join us too. Moral stance number two, however, is knowing beyond clock time. It says that reality, yes, does appear meaningless and absurd. But why should we be so closed-minded as to reject any possibility of help finding the meaning of life that comes to us from beyond whatever we can reach through our abilities to manipulate reality? There could be something so much more fulfilling out there than what we can discover on our own by doubting everything until we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. We may not have to confront the absurdity of reality alone. And therefore, let's open ourselves to the possibility of that meaning by finding people who have claimed to have discovered it and seeing if that works for us, adopting their practices and opening ourselves up to new potentials for self-transformation in that way. You should join us as well in this journey of discovery and spiritual exploration. Notice that both of these stances toward reality appeal to your moral senses and not your reason. In fact, there's no way to adjudicate between the two based purely on evidence and appeals to reason. Therefore, the common ground between believers and unbelievers in our time of secularity is that we both have to confront the fact that there are people who have chosen the exact opposite moral stance as us, but who seem to be living perfectly good lives. And this troubles us if we confront it fully, because it means that there's a possibility that we might be wrong. Now, of course, unbelievers can exist much more comfortably in the time of clock time, because clock time pushes us in that direction of saying, there's nothing really more out there. Everything that matters in this world is contained within whatever we can measure by clock time. But they will always be aware that there are believers out there who measure their lives by more than the clock, and who would be willing to give up many benefits in this world in exchange for higher meaning. And that seems crazy and even potentially a threat to the unbeliever's project of building a better life in the here and now. But for believers, it seems immoral that someone would not want to pursue the depths of self-transformation and fulfillment that can be found in reaching out to God. And yet there seem to be people who have just as much meaning in their life as they could care to have by living only for the here and now. But despite these differences, Both believers and unbelievers, therefore, are on the common ground of having to make moral judgments about how to approach reality that will only bear out in the future. They cannot know in advance whether that judgment is correct, and therefore they are exercising something that, from the believing side, is called faith. I don't think it's a secret that the Atlas Project is about introducing people to Christian beliefs, but I want to lay my cards fully on the table and say that this video is about inviting you to try on the practices of Christian faith. As I explained, it doesn't take much to feel that moral pull of clock time in your life that we all have to live in order to get along in this world. And that means that if you want to try out Christianity, you have to change some of the rhythms and habits of your life in order to give it its best shot, in order to feel the moral tug of the beyond. Maybe you're a committed atheist and you have no interest in that. That's okay. I hope this video has helped you to see that we share some common ground. Maybe you're a Christian watching this video. I hope you've learned that it's not just enough to know that God exists and believe that He wants to give you good things in this life. It's also important to let Him transform you in ways that prepare you to live with Him in the world to come. But who I really made this video for is that person who's on a journey, who feels that moral tug of both sides in their lives and wants to know how they can best be a good person. And my appeal to you is to take up some of the practices of Christian faith. Try them on and see if that doesn't open you to new realms of experience and a fullness of meaning that you haven't had before. You could try reading your Bible once a day or praying before you go to bed. You could try meeting with a group of Christian believers once a week, or maybe joining a 12-step group to help you overcome some bad habits or addictions in your life. And when you do that, I believe that God will come and reveal Himself in some way within your experience. And when that happens, you'll have a choice to make. I would say it's the first real choice you'll make in your life. And I hope you'll choose God. Well, thanks for sticking with me through that wild journey through history and philosophy. Again, I'm David Hamstra. I'd love to dialogue with you further about what I had to say or about some of the ideas of the sources I used. You can find me on Twitter at DJ Hamstra, and I'll be hanging out in the comments as well. If this video has touched you and you'd like to give back in some way, don't worry, we're fully funded. We're not asking for your money. But I would like to invite you to donate to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They support free speech and privacy on the internet. And for those of us who really value the information we find online, I think that's a great group to support. Thank you so much.